He died twice, and what he said changed everything.
I want to start by saying I am not a superstitious man. I spent 19 years in emergency medicine. I have seen things that would break most people, and I mean that literally. I have watched colleagues walk out of ERs mid-shift and never come back. I have seen nurses develop anxiety disorders so severe they couldn't enter a hospital building without trembling. I have attended therapy sessions where grown men who pulled people from car wrecks sat in silence for 40 minutes because there were no words left. I am not that kind of doctor. I was never that kind of doctor. I believe in science. I believe in data, in measurable outcomes, in the body's chemistry and its failures. I believe that what we call the supernatural is almost always a gap in our understanding, something we haven't explained yet. Give it enough time, enough research, and there will always be an answer. I believed that for 19 years. And then came the night of November 14th, and a man named Raymond Osei walked into my emergency room and changed everything I thought I knew. I need you to understand what that night looked like before Raymond arrived. It was a Tuesday, not a Friday, not a Saturday. The nights when we brace ourselves, when everyone from triage to the charge nurse knows to eat dinner early and say a prayer before the clock hits 10. Tuesday nights were supposed to be manageable. We were running at about 60% capacity. I had 2 residents shadowing me, a third-year named Dr. Priya Nair, who I'd been mentoring for 8 months, and a first-year named Marcus, who still flinched slightly every time a trauma alert went off. Good kids, sharp, the kind of team you wanted on a Tuesday. I remember I was finishing up with a 9-year-old who had fallen off a trampoline and fractured his wrist. His mother was holding his good hand and pretending not to cry, and I was explaining the casting process to the boy in that slightly theatrical way you develop when you want a child to feel like a partner in their own treatment rather than a passive victim of it. I was telling him he could pick the color of his cast. He was deciding between blue and green with the gravity of someone signing a peace treaty. That was when the radio crackdown from the paramedics outside came through. 47-year-old male, found unresponsive in his vehicle in a parking garage. No pulse on scene. CPR initiated. Out of ETA 3 minutes, I handed the trampoline boy off to Marcus and moved. Raymond Osei arrived at 9:47 p.m. I remember the time because I checked the clock on the wall as they wheeled him through the bay doors. A habit I developed early in my career. The documentation reflex. The instinct to timestamp everything. He was on a gurney, 2 paramedics working him, 1 doing compressions, 1 bagging him. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, wearing a gray suit jacket that had been cut open at the chest. His face was slack in a way that faces only get when consciousness has fully left the building. His name, I would learn later, was on his work badge, which was still clipped to the lapel of his ruined jacket. He was an accountant. He worked on the 6th floor of a building 2 blocks from the hospital. He had no pulse. He had been without a pulse, the paramedics told me, for approximately 11 minutes before they got him back in the ambulance. They'd achieved a brief return of spontaneous circulation, AIR-OSC we call it, about 90 seconds before arrival, then lost it again. I took over compressions myself while Priya managed the airway, and we ran the full protocol. Epinephrine, shock, more compressions. I have done this so many times that my body knows the rhythm independently of conscious thought. The heel of my hand, the locked elbows, the 2 inches of depression, the rate. You stop counting. You just do. At 10:04 p.m., Raymond Osei's heart started again. Not a flutter, not a brief blip on the monitor that you have to squint at to interpret. A full, sustained sinus rhythm, strong, almost aggressive in how cleanly it came back. I felt like a machine rebooting rather than an organ recovering. Priya actually said, "Whoa," quietly, which she immediately looked embarrassed about. I understood the impulse. He was alive. We stabilized him and moved him to the ICU, and I remember thinking, with the specific satisfaction that emergency medicine occasionally provides, that this was going to be a good outcome, that somewhere a family was going to get a phone call that ended with relief instead of grief. That Raymond Osei, accountant 6th floor, was going to go home. I was charting at the nurse's station at 10:51 p.m. when the ICU called down. Raymond was awake. This was not routine. Patients who have been down as long as Raymond often don't wake for hours, sometimes days, sometimes never. Anoxic brain injury is brutal and unpredictable. Made for him to regain consciousness within 45 minutes of resuscitation was remarkable wasn't even the right word. It was extraordinary. The ICU nurse, a veteran named Dolores who had been on that floor for over 2 decades, said he was awake, alert, oriented, and asking to speak to the doctor who brought him back. I went up. When I walked into Raymond's room, he was sitting up slightly in the bed, the ICU monitors beeping their steady rhythm around him, an oxygen cannula under his nose, an IV in his left arm. His eyes found me immediately when I came through the door. They were the most alert eyes I had ever seen on a man who had been clinically dead less than an hour before. "You're the one," he said. His voice was rough. That was expected, given the intubation, but steady. "I'm Dr. Ellison," I said. "Oh, I was one of the team that treated you downstairs. How are you feeling?" "I need to tell you something," he said, "before I forget it, before it fades." I pulled a chair to his bedside. I have had many conversations with patients in the immediate aftermath of cardiac events. They are often emotional, occasionally confused, sometimes euphoric in a way that is almost unsettling. I was prepared for all of that. "Go ahead," I said. Raymond Osei looked at me for a moment, studying me, I thought, as if deciding whether I could be trusted. And then he said, "I was somewhere else while you were working on me." I kept my expression neutral. "A lot of patients describe sensations during resuscitation," I said carefully. "The brain under hypoxic stress can—" "I know what you're going to say," he interrupted, not rudely, calmly. "Oh, I know the explanations. I'm not talking about a hallucination. I'm telling you what I saw." I nodded. "Tell me." He told me he had been in a corridor. That's the word he used. Corridor. Not tunnel, not light, not any of the images that have been culturally attached to near-death experiences through decades of books and television. A corridor. Like the hallway of an office building, he said, except that the walls were made of something that wasn't quite solid. Something that moved slightly at the edges of his vision when he tried to look directly at it. He said there were other people in the corridor. Not many, 4 or 5 standing at intervals, facing away from him. He said he understood, and this was the part where his voice dropped slightly, where the steadiness wavered. He said he understood without being told that these people were waiting, that they had been waiting for a long time, that waiting was what the corridor was for. He said one of them turned around and looked at him. It was a woman. Middle-aged, he said, wearing dark clothing, her face, and this is where he paused for a long time. Her face was familiar. He couldn't explain why. He had never seen her before. He was certain of that. But something about her face produced in him a feeling of recognition so powerful that he started to move toward her. And then everything went white, and he was back in his body, and the monitor was screaming, and there were hands on his chest. He finished and looked at me. "I know how this sounds," and he said, "It sounds like a profound experience," I said, which was truthful and non-committal, and exactly what I'd been trained to offer in those moments. "The woman," he said, "I think I need to know who she is." I told him to rest. I told him we'd talk more in the morning. I told him his family had been contacted and his wife was on her way. He nodded and let his head fall back against the pillow, but his eyes stayed open, looking at the ceiling. And I had the distinct impression that the corridor was still very present for him in a way I couldn't access. I went back downstairs. At 1:23 a.m., the ICU called again. Raymond's heart had stopped for the second time. This time the team was already there. ICU staff, faster response, crash cart ready. They worked him for 22 minutes. His rhythm would not come back. At 1:45 a.m., Raymond Osei was declared dead. I was called up to sign the paperwork. Dolores met me outside the room. She had been a nurse for 23 years, and her face almost never showed anything. But that night, in the fluorescent hallway outside room 14, she looked shaken. "Did he say anything to you?" she asked me. "When you were in there earlier?" He described a near-death experience, I said. Fairly vivid. A corridor. Other people waiting. A woman he recognized but didn't know. Dolores was quiet for a moment. "He told me the same thing," she said. "He called me in around midnight. Said he needed to tell someone again, in case it mattered. He said..." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "He said the woman in the corridor had been wearing a name tag." Something cold moved through me. "I don't know how else to describe it. He said he couldn't read it while he was there," Dolores continued. "Soraya, but right before he woke up, right when everything went white, he said the name came to him, like it had been placed in his memory rather than read." "What was the name?" I asked. Dolores looked at me for a long moment. "Margaret Ellison," she said. I stood in that hallway and felt the floor do something it had never done in 19 years of emergency medicine, which was become uncertain. My mother's name. My mother, who had died 14 years earlier of a cardiac event. My mother, whose maiden name I had kept as my own when I entered medicine. The name on my badge. The name Raymond Osei would have seen when I sat next to his bed. I told myself immediately, efficiently, with the trained clinical reflex of a man who had spent 2 decades insisting on explanations. I told myself that he had read my badge, that the name had lodged in his brain at some unconscious level beneath the hypoxic confusion, and that his mind had built a story around it, that the human brain, desperate for meaning in the face of death, will reach for any material at hand and weave it into something that feels like revelation. I told myself this. I tell myself this still. But here is what I cannot explain. My badge doesn't say Margaret Ellison. It says Dr. J. Ellison. My first name is James. The only person who ever called me by my mother's surname was my mother herself. She used it as a joke, in the way mothers do, a sign of mock formality when she wanted my attention. Raymond Osei could not have read Margaret Ellison on my name tag. I signed the death certificate. I drove home at 3 in the morning. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. Raymond Osei was an accountant. He had no connection to me, to my family, to my mother's name. He had been dead for 11 minutes when he arrived at my hospital. He had been resuscitated, regained consciousness, told 2 separate people about a corridor and a woman wearing a name tag, and then died again. I do not have an explanation. I have looked for one. I have read every paper on near-death experiences, every neurological study on hypoxic hallucinations, every philosophical argument for and against consciousness surviving physical death. I have had conversations with colleagues at 2 in the morning that wandered into territory none of us were trained to navigate. I have sat across from chaplains and therapists, and once, a physicist who specialized in quantum consciousness theories, in a meeting that left me with more questions than I arrived with. I am still a man who believes in science, but I am also now a man who cannot fully explain what happened in that hospital on the night of November 14th. And I have come to believe, reluctantly, carefully, in the way that only evidence can shift a conviction, that there are things at the border between living and dying that our instruments cannot yet measure. Raymond Osei died twice in my emergency room, and somewhere in between, in a corridor that wasn't any place I know how to locate, he met a woman named Margaret. She was waiting. That part, I think, is the part that gets me most. Not that she was there, but that she was waiting, as if she had known he was coming, as if she had known that he would see her, remember her name, and carry it back to the one person on earth it would mean something to. I retired from emergency medicine 8 months after that night. My colleagues assumed it was burnout. 19 years is a long time, and the attrition rate in our field is brutal and unsentimental. No one asked too many questions. I didn't correct them. How do you explain to a colleague that you left emergency medicine because a dead man gave you a message from your mother? How do you put that in a sentence that doesn't sound like grief or exhaustion or the particular psychological fraying that the job can produce? You don't. You nod when they throw you a small retirement party. You accept the card with everyone's signatures. You drive home and sit with it. I still think about the card. I think about the 4 or 5 people standing at intervals, facing away, waiting. I think about what it means to wait like that, patiently, without apparent distress, as if waiting is simply what you do there, as natural as breathing is here. I think about whether my mother waited like that, whether she has been waiting for 14 years in that not quite solid space, in that corridor that a man named Raymond Osei passed through on a Tuesday night in November. I think about whether waiting in that place feels anything like waiting here. I hope not. I hope it is easier than that. I hope it is nothing like the waiting we do. The anxious, time-aware, loss-conscious waiting of the living. I hope she is somewhere the walls don't feel like walls. I hope she is not afraid. I spent 19 years in emergency medicine because I believed I could hold the line between living and dying. That I could stand at that border with science and training and sheer force of will and pull people back from the edge. Raymond Osei taught me that the border is not where I thought it was, that there is something on the other side of it that I have no instruments to measure, and that sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes something crosses back. I don't know what to call that. I have tried every word I know. The closest I can get is this. It feels like a message in a language I was never taught, delivered through a man who had no reason to carry it, addressed to someone who wasn't sure he still needed to receive it. My name is James Ellison, and I was an emergency room doctor for 19 years, and the patient who died twice still haunts me to this day. Not because I can't explain what happened, but because part of me, the part that drove home at 3 in the morning and sat in the driveway and couldn't go inside, doesn't want to.